usually. Hello, welcome. Hi, everybody. Those of you who are up late, cheering, debating, watching the State of the Union, here's a little bit more of the talking head chatter, except we're going to drill down on an issue that we know a lot of our friends here in the world of privacy and tech policy really want to focus on. So delighted to have some stellar friends of ours with us. I'm going to let them quickly introduce themselves as they go around the horn. Hopefully, since I think we're on my page, are we on my page or the FPF page? In any event, hopefully you all know that I'm Jules Polonetsky, CEO of the Future of Privacy Forum. Thanks for catching us today. Put down what you're doing. You'll catch up with your meetings or your memos later. Let's spend a couple of minutes trying to figure out whether we heard anything that's going to tell us what happens in 2023 on some of the biggest tech policy issues, and particularly privacy and data protection, where many of the folks on this screen have been eager to see serious legislation passed to support both kind of uses of data we think can be helpful and to constrain the problematic, challenging, and difficult ones that we want to see barred, eliminated, or constrained. I'll go around my screen starting on my top left, right. Amy, who are you?
Who am I? That's a very deep question for 10 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. Hi, everybody. My name is Amy Stepanovich. I have the great pleasure of working with Jules as the Vice President for U.S. Policy at the Future Privacy Forum, and am really most excited to hear from our wonderful guest speakers. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over for them to introduce themselves.
Awesome. And Chris.
Hello, my name is Christopher Wood. I'm the Executive Director and Co-founder of LGBT Tech, organization working at the intersection of technology and the LGBTQ community.
Awesome. Cam.
Hi, I'm Cam Carey. I'm the Ann and Andrew Tisch Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Brookings Institution Center for Technology and Innovation, which I joined soon after leaving the Obama administration in 2013, and there led the administration's work on privacy, trying to get developing privacy legislation. I continue to focus on that at Brookings, unfinished business, but I'm adopting what the president said, let's finish the job.
And Joan.
Joan O'Hara, thank you very much for having me today. I am Senior Vice President with the XR Association. We are a relatively new trade association. We're under 4 years old, and we focus specifically on XR technology. So for those of you who are not familiar, that's virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. You may have heard the term the metaverse over the past year. That's sort of our bailiwick. So we represent the broad ecosystem from individual developers all the way up to big tech companies like Meta. And I lead our government relations and policy efforts.
Thanks, Joan. And since State of the Union ends up often being a lot about politics, we've got a relatively, we are a nonpartisan organization, but we've got folks who hail from different spectrums over their careers of the political world, having worked or served in Democrat and Republican administrations, and me, who has worked in both Democrat and Republican roles in my earlier days. But policy is often politics in Washington. So let's talk about the politics of the speech first. It was clearly, I thought, a speech aimed at that centrist swing voter who maybe doesn't appreciate the successes that the Biden administration would like to see celebrated or recognized. Perhaps some of the tech policy stuff, which I think we were all thinking was going to play a bigger role. I think we all saw advance briefings or advance information sheets, and it seemed like there was a bit more. And that's probably not what the swing voter in the crossover state goes to the polls based on, right? It's the economy, it's cultural and social issues, it's a range of others. Am I right that this was maybe, I mean, these are always political speeches, but sometimes it's a big set of a lot of policy prescriptions, and there was a lot in there, but it really felt like somebody kind of took a pen and said, hey, there are elections coming up, and that middle voter doesn't seem to be swinging. They're still up for grabs. Was that your take as well? I'll start with Cam on this one.
To an extent, Jules, look, I think a lot of the effort was certainly to stake out sort of kitchen table economic issues that play in some sense to Biden's sort of down Pennsylvania strengths. But I think this was also historic in the sense that he did go deeper than he did last year on privacy and in terms of talking about the stricter limits on the data that companies collect. And this was an element of the unity agenda. A lot of things in what he termed his unity agenda didn't get bipartisan support on the floor yesterday, but this did. It got a standing ovation. And Kevin McCarthy, when he sat down, nodded at stricter limits on data collection. So I think it does bode well for getting something done, that this can be a piece of the unity agenda that moves forward.
Well, Joan, tell me though, you've also worked at senior levels in the political government. My take, and Cam properly recognizes that, well, it's more than last year, and that's a lot for a State of the Union. Are we sort of data protection geeks, ever going to see something like privacy? Is this a political voter issue? And maybe it didn't get as much in the last couple of edits because somebody thought, like, let's give 2 paragraphs on junk fees because that's going to score votes, while the more esoteric, as important as I think we all appreciate it is to the economy, the users and so forth, not probably on like the top 3 things that determine whether a swing voter pulls a lever.
It's interesting, the whole State of the Union concept and how it's evolved. Leading up to this, I was reading articles in various media outlets, the common ones like Washington Post, New York Times, etc., about how the State of the Union used to be a real State of the Union address to Congress, and it was very succinct, and it was key points of things that were like burning issues that the Congress needed to address. And it has sort of evolved into, I think, more almost like a very long campaign speech in some ways. So there's always a lot of rhetoric, and I think there's an effort to try and cover everything. There was a lot packed into the speech last night. But I think you got it right, Jules, that, it's kind of like a hierarchy of needs, and economic issues and people's paychecks and the cost of gas and all of that stuff is more at the bottom of the pyramid, and tech privacy might be more towards the top. But I do think it's a positive sign that there's consistency. So it was mentioned in the last address. It's something that has been consistent throughout the last 2 years of Congress. Although we didn't get comprehensive legislation passed, I think we did get closer than we have before. So I'm bullish on seeing something. I think another forcing factor is that the Europeans are being pretty aggressive on this, and it's impacting U.S. companies as well, and U.S. states. And as we've seen, some individual states are sort of taking their lead from what European countries, the UK in particular, have done around this. So I think there are a number of forcing functions going into this Congress that I'm optimistic that we'll see progress and hopefully get something across the finish line.
Amy, do you think we should read anything into, I don't think Section 230, which we thought was going to be there, right? The administration put out an op-ed, and again, it was in some of these earlier briefings. Again, did someone just go through and say, well, this is already, an hour plus of things and tick points, and so sorry, that doesn't mean we're not, engaged on this issue. They obviously put out an op-ed and that sort of thing. But did I miss it, or what do we read? Do you think that's political pushback, or just sort of someone having to say, sorry, can't be 112 things in here, there can only be 100 things?
It's interesting. I actually find that the parts where tech and specifically data privacy and security were implicit in the speech as interesting as the parts where they were explicit. So for instance, you talk about the things that weren't in there, Jules, and I think, can we read about 230 making it or not making it? Potentially, we do have some talk about the damage of platforms with our children, the need to regulate. But we then have talk about supply chain and needing to build things more in America. Anybody who's watched the cybersecurity space for the last many years know the many cybersecurity vulnerabilities that have been introduced by having components of our technologies built overseas and integrated into the products that we use, not only here, but around the world. There was talk about electric vehicles and the power grid needing to be secure. We had lots of, I think, dynamic conversations about connected power grid and what that means for privacy when it started coming online. And I think that's going to continue to proliferate. Talking about, and I'd love to turn a little bit to Chris on this, equality of LGBTQ Americans and needing to make sure that they're passing the Equality Act. But Chris and I worked on this report on how with data privacy and the use of data, that community often gets left behind, and the risks to that community aren't taken into consideration. So even though the actual call for a comprehensive data privacy bill comprised a whole sentence in our 100 or 112 point speech that we heard, I honestly think if you listen hard and read between the lines, you'll see a lot more on it than what was there on its face.
Amy, I completely agree with you. I think that's there was a lot that wasn't said, but was said without really being implicit about it. I think Jules, to your original point of, he was really reaching into the middle class, really talking about that in a big way, trying to tie some of these issues to things that they really cared about, because every day, I live out in rural Virginia, and I think that's one thing that I really try to listen to as I'm moving around my spaces here, working in local organizations or working with local individuals or the boards I sit on. And I think that's one thing I definitely heard a lot of the opening that speech about defining America in one word: possibility, talking about unemployment, talking about healthcare, talking about the bringing the manufacturing jobs in. But I think in a lot of those pieces, talking about equality in employment wasn't really brought up yesterday in a substantive way, but we know the administration is doing a lot. To Amy's point, just the other day, maybe about a week or two ago, the administration released guidance on collecting sexual orientation and gender identity data, of which we worked on with FPF. But that wasn't really brought up, but it was brought up in kind of in the smaller one sentence word. So I think you're correct in there was a lot that was said, but there was, I think, even more that wasn't said. But really continuing to tie that to the issues that are important to everyday Americans living in rural and different places around the country, where maybe people are just not paying attention to some of these issues, but are paying attention to their wallet, to their health, to some of the other larger reproductive rights and gun violence. So definitely agree with a lot of that. And I think there is a lot of movement on these pieces. I'm curious to see where it goes as we move into the rest of 2023.
So let's unpack. Go ahead.
To Amy's point about supply chain and about Make It in America, I think there's an interesting connection to the hearing last week by the House Energy and Commerce Committee. It was supposed to be about those issues, about China and our supply chain security. Became very much a hearing about data privacy and the security implications of that as we, as TikTok collects data and worry about where data is being transmitted.
So the interesting dynamic, obviously, the localization and the challenge of cross-border engagement with Europe has been one where the administration has been active in helping negotiate a new cross-border, agreement, which we obviously wait for the European Data Protection Board opinion, the Parliament opinion, and of course, I guess eventually the ECJ opinion. But we also know that the Europeans have been quite put out by some of the build in the U.S. and the significant subsidies for U.S. climate and so on and so forth. And these are of course different things, but at the end of the day, ambassadors and governments sit down and is this focus on do it in America, while many of us who think that you need cross-border research and vaccines are developed around the world and data's got to be used and compared and so forth. Is there going to be a dynamic? I will tell you, during COVID, one of the senior executives from the European Commission was in for sort of a small embassy event. And since it was COVID, there were just a few of us, we were all spread out. And I was sitting next to this vice president of the commission. And of course, I wanted to twist his arm about the challenges of cross-border flows and can we get a deal done? And he kept bringing up the dissatisfaction the commission had with how the European transit visas during COVID, we weren't, being flexible enough. And I kept bringing up this, and he kept saying, why do you think the White House is being so difficult about that? Right. And so kind of dawned that, of course, again, these are different issues. They'll all be dealt with separately, but politics are politics. And what impact does the fact that whether it's the TikTok in China or this, we got to protect our data by keeping it here and we need to localize and so forth, supply chains, obviously doing it with friends and democratic partners globally is the right path. But we are, is there a political challenge here to global data flows because of some of the sort of US first nuance? Joan, what's your take on that?
I think we've got, the full spectrum. We've got diehard globalists and diehard protectionists. And the way forward, as with most things, is somewhere in the middle there. Obviously, we want to put the United States in a position to continue to be a world leader in just about everything. And that will involve some, America first type of mentality on certain issues. But at the same time, especially when it comes to data and internet and cybersecurity and all of that, there's, those things don't stop at a geographic border. So I think there's an imperative for us to be working with allies. I've seen more movement towards that, and maybe my co-panelists here have seen the same. But I see more countries talking to each other about regulation around this space. And what are the commonalities, and how can we sort of come together to create a framework that is going to work for everyone? Not an easy task, but I think we'll start to see more of that international cooperation around regulation in this space.
I want to pull up the exact language that the President Biden used and try to unpack, okay, what does this mean exactly? Does this mean support for specific legislation? Does this mean the ADPA? What does it mean? But before I do, one of the commenters in our conversation here pointed out the EU influence on the American privacy landscape, and presumably this was reaction to the note that California and the UK design code for kids and teens, even specifically references in the guidance that you should look to the UK ICO for, support and interpreting. So it's not just influence; it's like we're almost locking together, But at the same time, much of the state and the federal proposed bills, I almost wish they would be taking GDPR, and if there are particular turns of GDPR that people think need to be tweaked and edited, given that so many organizations are complying globally with GDPR, editing and working from a common text, even if we were, I don't know, I would like to make the research sharing, more flexible. The Europeans have had to go back, and although they are not amending GDPR, they're putting together substantial efforts to try to get data available for research and, creating sort of balancing challenges with GDPR. Should the European model be, frankly, doing more? A chief privacy officer said to me the other day, as they were kind of stressed with some of the complications of what the ADPA would do in particular areas, advertising and research, and said, why can't we just use GDPR? And I said, because you and your lobbyists spent the last 5 years telling Congress that was the worst thing ever, right? Well, I don't know. Now that I see some of the complicated language, so I know we've often tried to say, hey, why don't you just use the term processor if that's what you mean, instead of like inventing, new terms that don't work. So quick take, start maybe with Amy. It is how much European influence are we seeing? And frankly, do we want more? It took 7 years or so to get GDPR done. And we're doing this pretty quick. I mean, Cam, you've been working on this for a long time, but it seems like the current folks of sort of starting from scratch. They didn't go back to, the bill that you spent a lot of time on, although there are obviously key influences over there. And I sort of wish in some places, they would, because there was a deep, administration run, multi-stakeholder process. People can agree or disagree, but there was a lot of input. When COVID broke out, I remember thinking, how are the Europeans going to deal with this? They got us stuck with the GDPR. But no, there was somebody thought about it over 7 years, and there was a, pandemic, exception, built in to recognize that. There's a Santa Claus exception built in, right, for churches and so forth. So there are some lessons because there's a lot of nuance in there. So Amy, I got in trouble the other day on a panel saying that ITF put together. I said we should do more actually to learn from sort of the GDPR, not just because there's a global standard, but because there's a lot of nuance in there. We may not like the way certain data protection authorities have narrowed, things that I always thought were broader than we are learning some of the DPAs think. Not being able to use data for product improvement or for security, without, a different separate legal basis that might even include opt-out. I mean, there's not a data protection lawyer, I know who, wouldn't be a bit surprised. We saw it from the EDPB, but it was, I think surprising in a lot of ways. What's your take?
It's interesting. I spent a lot of years in a previous life doing human rights work at Access Now. And I worked out of from our Brussels office with maybe some of the biggest fans of the GDPR in the world. People who were really pro GDPR. And I took it to heart when people in the US would say, why don't we just incorporate GDPR into US law? That their immediate reaction was always, don't do that. It was always no. And the rationale was Europe has years, if not decades, of common law and documents and decisions that support the GDPR and that are inputted into it through interpretations and through language and specific terms that the US just doesn't have. And so to just directly take big chunks of it and put it into US law, I think would be a misguided approach. But that said, I think that there are key concepts that we should learn and that we have learned from seeing GDPR, from watching compliance with GDPR, enforcement of GDPR. Unfortunately, it seems to have skipped the federal level and seeped straight down to the states, those lessons, but now maybe they're coming back up to the federal level. And we definitely don't want something that is totally out of focus with the GDPR, which means we need to know what is going on, what it means. Regulators can't ignore it. And so we should be learning those lessons. We should be figuring out what GDPR does and is, and Americans are doing that a little bit more and more. We figured out in some cases what a processor is. We figured out what a legitimate basis is sometimes. But maybe not direct language. And I think that's one of the problems we see now with the age appropriate design code, Jules, which is where you started, going from the UK to California, and it just being not only slightly out of touch with some of the benefits that children and youth get from using online resources. Again, talking about the report that we released with LGBT Tech, looking at LGBT youth and how they have been able to use the internet to escape toxic or harmful households or communities, and really explore who they are. And we want to make sure those benefits continue. We don't necessarily want a US law that's referencing UK guidance documents. But again, learning those lessons, seeing what's coming out of the US, out of the UK, out of beyond, out of the EU and the UK, sorry, and beyond the EU. We should be looking at South America, at Singapore, countries in the African Union. A lot of people around the world are working on privacy and data protection right now. And I think we need to cast a broad net to make sure we're not out of sync with any of those jurisdictions.
So let's look at the exact language and see what we think you as readers, insiders here, everyone interested in legislation should garner from it. Amy clipped out a lot of the really relevant pieces, so I'm reading here I think the key part. We must finally hold social media companies accountable for the experiment they are running on our children for profit. So it can be a lot of things that means, right? And it's time to pass bipartisan legislation to stop big tech from collecting personal data on kids and teenagers online, ban targeted advertising to children, doesn't say children and teens here. Interesting. Kids and teens in the first, children in the second. I don't want to read too much into it, and impose stricter limits on the personal data these companies collect on all of us. So only big tech, I don't think they mean only big tech, but it says only big tech, heavily kids and teen focus, but also limits on what these companies collect on all of us. Did we hear, start with you, Chris, a call for comprehensive legislation? I think that's what we were hoping for. Did we hear a call for kids and teens? Is this a big tech only? What should we take from the, we know that lots of eyes go into this, lots of agencies want things in there, lots of constituencies, so the words here are, at the end of the day, political and speechwriter, but a lot of fingers on this. What did you take from those words?
I think you're right. I think big tech is a buzzword. It's something that's across the news heavily right now. But in reality, we cannot go ahead and create legislation that's only going to focus on big tech. It has to be any company entering the space, any company collecting data for whatever reason, using data, using AI. I think that's really crucial. I think to Joan's point, technology doesn't know borders. And as long as the country that you're in allows that technology to be in the country or work, and even sometimes that's not the case, I think it's crucial to understand that. And I think to Amy's point and yours, Jules, quite frankly, America has fallen behind in being the leader in this space. Do I think that's necessarily a bad thing as I'm looking at it through my lens of marginalized communities, the LGBTQ community? No. And I say no because I think that it's crucial that I think it's really crucial that individuals have the ability to fully understand the impact across cross-border and understand that there are LGBTQ individuals and individuals with disability and individuals from marginalized communities across the globe who are impacted differently by countries' laws. And so we do have to look at this from a global perspective. And it's really important that the United States, especially at the state level, if we're going to be passing these, but even more so at the federal level, that we're looking at this from a holistic perspective that actually protects individuals and does it in a way that that can go cross-border. I know it's a really broad piece. I want to make sure we have time to let Cam weigh in here because I know he has a hard stop. Cam?
Well, thank you. look, I think you have to read this as talking about comprehensive legislation. I mean, the part about putting limits on what businesses can collect about us, that is comprehensive legislation, and that is really the essence of what a federal privacy bill has to get at. So, yeah, there's a lot packed in there, but some of that is just the politics, focusing on big tech, leading with kids. I think is pitching this, but it's clearly got a broader view to it.
Cam, I know you have to jump out. Let me ask you just one quick.
Yeah.
Is it your take that the White House will now do something more? Lots of us were eager for them to be a little more involved. Tim Wu, formerly of the White House, tweeted last night,
Right.
privacy legislation can happen this Congress. The president has called for it. Businesses on board. Republicans are generally on board. And California's obstructionism is less relevant, probably meaning Nancy Pelosi moving on from speaker. Key is to so
Mhm.
be nice if we heard that when he was in the White House, but okay, he can speak freely now. I guess the White House doesn't, want to insult Nancy Pelosi, nor do any of us. But flagging. Do we think there's gonna be any activity based on this? What is this and the op-ed? Do they show up at the table now? What happens?
Yeah, look, they're obviously are being a little bit more forward on this than they were last fall. I think the White House was treading carefully because of Pelosi as speaker, and because of other political and policy priorities. There's other must-do legislation that in the lame duck. So to invest a lot in trying to get privacy was particularly given the Pelosi situation was difficult, and there was an election, so they're kind of keeping their eye on that ball. But now, at the beginning of a new congressional term, I think there's more opportunity to engage. We'll see how much that involves, but there was some behind the scenes involvement. I mean, certainly, from a policy standpoint, the notion of limits on collection, use, and sharing was, and I think some of the direction that the bill took came in part from the White House. So I think there is a commitment on those aspects of the issue.
Thanks, Cam. And Kim, I know you had a hard stop, so
Okay.
busy day
Well,
for
thank
you.
you.
Thank you for joining us, and
Good to
good to see you again.
Take care. Bye.
Joan, from your perspective, dealing with White House policy and political issues and the like, any take that? I mean, this is a document that typically folks in the administration feel like the president said X. Someone's going to say, "You said X was your initiative. What are you doing?" I'll add to Cam's point, not only Pelosi, but Senator Schumer supports his committee chairs. That's part of what you do as the majority leader. And Senator Cantwell, as we all know, was not on board that initiative. And so, getting in the middle of, hey, can we help have some discussions? But to the extent that some people were like, that's the bipartisan thing, make that happen, recognizing that Senator Cantwell has still significant issues, from what we hear, still has very significant issues. What's your take? Do they now try to negotiate a little harder and try to bridge between her, perhaps providing support in the way a White House can, bring a bigger scope and package to the table?
I think so. Everybody had a chance to breathe a little bit between last Congress and this Congress, and I think things were running high as we got closer to the end of the Congress, and there was a lot of pressure to just get something over the line, and people had put a lot of work and a lot of effort into trying to resolve differences, and it seemed like the sides were getting further entrenched the closer we got to December. But now that there's been some breathing room, the president has elevated this as a priority. As I said earlier, there's a consistency here that this is an issue that America is prioritizing. So I think we'll, again, maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I think we'll see movement on it. I think there'll be more of an appetite to negotiate. But if I could just, listening to what everyone has been saying, it seems to me that we're almost like at a sort of an existential moment. And if you zoom out to the 30,000-foot view, we're in a place right now where technology is changing the way that we live, whether it's, social media and the internet, or the technology that I work on most of the time, extended reality, immersive technologies, artificial intelligence, where, there are some really heavy questions around what impact that will have. I think we're at a moment where, these are human issues. We have to determine how we want to live, what role will technology play in our lives? And there's some really profound questions there. And, science fiction writers have been dealing with this for decades, but a lot of this stuff is now, it's real. So, that's one of the things that I'm encouraged by in the XR space, is that XR technology is out there, it's being used, it's a benefit, tremendous benefit, and especially in places like healthcare, manufacturing, et cetera. But it's not part of every household at this point. So the fact that we're asking these tough questions and having these really intense policy debates around topics like privacy, what does privacy look like? What does it mean to a person to have a private life? I'm glad that we're asking those questions now, because again, I think we're at a pivotal moment where technology is going to become much more impactful. So for us to sort of set the parameters and shape what role technology will play in our lives, I think it's really existential. And I'm glad we're having these conversations now.
Yeah, I think it's well said. There was a time earlier in my career, and even in the earlier years of FPF, where I was very skeptical that, given the pace of technology moving and given the kludginess of legislation, that we would get it right if we legislated based on some amorphous, let's fix this, let's fix that. But I think where we are today is most of the issues that we're debating aren't really hardcore, very narrow privacy. Am I marketing too much? They're the existential issues of what we want the world to look like, and bullying and harassment and civil rights and every aspect of human identity and LGBTQ issues. I mean, and at the end of the day, it's not on companies. We just see the controversy when you tell Facebook, you decide whether President Trump should be in.
Right.
You do it, we hate you. You don't do it, we hate you. Like, who wants? And I think there was a time where companies said, hey, laissez-faire, the internet can't be, ruled by anybody. And I think right now, the reason the timing is right is because just about any company, even the ones who kind of, hey, I'm going to do crazy and new innovative things, don't constrain me, recognize that every one of these issues, whether it's an XR thing or a biometric, who is going to decide? I can't, with 30 years of working in this space, I can't tell you the right way to set governance issues around XR issues. What contexts are right? How do you deal with identity issues, right? How does the LGBT community, I'll turn to you, Chris, here, kind of come to this space where, people can express, but also can be harassed? Like, we do need policymakers guided by psychologists and ethicists and anthropologists. Let's take our time. I don't want legislation super duper fast. I want a thoughtful, hard process where people recognize that there are really hard issues that only democratic process can solve. Chris?
I agree with you. We do need to take our time in this. We need to make sure we have all the information globally, that we're looking at what is working globally and not working globally as we're creating these processes. States most certainly need to be taking, if they're going to be writing any types of data privacy bills or anything to do with data and our privacy, they need to be looking at it from a global perspective and not just their individual state, because that does roll up into federal legislation, as well as the way it impacts users across the board. In particular, I think it's important to recognize, the call out for the Equality Act, and specifically, President Biden talked about protecting our transgender Americans. And our transgender community is one of the hardest impact, especially if they are also part of the Black community or Asian Pacific Islander community. There are other barriers and challenges that they're facing as individuals where it's hard to get employment. It's hard hard to get specific health care that they need. There's so many different intersections that can impact LGBTQ Americans with disabilities, other marginalized communities. I think this brings up some of the work that I've done at the FCC over the last 19 months. We were tasked as part of the CEDC to define digital discrimination, which I had to really, as part of the IIJA, I had to really pull into that and look at what was not being said. We were talking about not being said. There was so much not said in defining digital discrimination that impacted so many different communities that I thought it was important that, sure, there were other groups that were really going to be diving into the model codes and what's happening at the state level, but I thought it was really crucial and important for my working group to really dive into what was not said and making sure that the FCC is looking and following the Communications Act and in serving all Americans. So I think that is one way that I really look at this. Is sure, I look a lot through the lens of the LGBTQ community, but truly, as we look at the equality and ensuring that there's equity across for LGBTQ, that actually helps so many different marginalized communities, including the disability community, who is also not a monolith and spans all other marginalized communities. I think it's important, that work has an impact on so many. I think one of the pieces that, as I was listening to you all kind of talk, and I don't want to divert too much here, but I think there's so much that plays into, as I think about protecting kids' data, but also we don't have a lot of data around, Jules, you talked about the research piece. We don't have a lot of data around LGBTQ individuals. So ensuring that research availability is there so we can serve our LGBTQ individuals around the globe in a better way is important. But if we don't have the data, and we're not able to actually collect that data and use it, I'm not saying that companies should do it, but I think these are the pieces that we need to be thinking about. Technology has the ability for us to really change the way we help and how fast we can address certain issues, especially as AI is coming on board. But we have to make sure that the right information is being plugged into the AI platforms to make sure that we're actually putting out and spitting out data that's actually going to help. So it is complex, and I think there's a lot here. I think the other piece is that I also look at what not just LGBT, but what our youth have access to in this country. I'm grateful that in my kids' school we have access to their, fourth grade, they're using 3D printers, which I think is amazing. But not every school system has access to that stuff. Not every school system is being exposed to that stuff. And quite frankly, kids from various areas around the country may not even touch an XR headset until they're in high school or maybe beyond. And therefore that puts them really behind. So I think that this is a very complex issue in the way that we approach it. Jules, I agree with you in the fact that
Chris, I want your thought on something and the others as well. And tell me if I'm overstating this, because I don't want to be, I sometimes maybe get a little bit too political. So you saw in Florida during Christmas, there was a drag queen Christmas holiday show. And parents who thought like, hey, that's great. I want my kid to come with me. It's going to be a good show. I'm making a decision. I'm going to find this entertaining and interesting. Went to the show. The governor is now kicked off an investigation as to whether this venue violated laws or was doing something wrong by allowing kids who accompanied their parents to this venue. There is a huge push to get different kinds of kids and teens, 17-and-a-half-year-olds, covered by the proposed laws that say that if you have a venue where there might be a lot of teens, then you must provide the strongest privacy defaults, and you might need to force people to authenticate to prove what their age is and isn't. I'm worried that this is going to open the door. We've got this cultural war going on in this country. We've got folks who, are running around worried about grooming, worried about exposure for what they think their ideology is, whatever their ideology is. They want to, ensure that the state gets to enforce this so they can protect children from what they think is not right. clearly we need stronger laws and teens who are today not protected in the way kids are from some of the most targeted forms of advertising, some of the bullying, some of the addictive type behavior. But I'm a bit worried that we're driving down this path that's going to force everybody who wants to use AR or VR headset or has a site that does gaming, does anything where there are lots of teens, which is kind of everywhere. They use email, they use every single service. I don't want a gay or lesbian teen to be forced to authenticate if they want to access content that maybe their parent doesn't know about, or maybe their parent does know, but the governor of that state doesn't think that they should be learning about. Am I overstating this? It just seems like there are lots of kid safety people who I deeply respect who want to protect teens and aren't maybe thinking about some of the misuses that happen of some of these statutes, because we see that around the world. We see that.
Yeah, we're driving towards an extreme, which we don't agree with at all. Quite frankly, as a parent myself, I will make the decisions for my children as to what they can be exposed to and at what age they can be exposed to it. I don't need a governor or a federal law to tell me that. Obviously, we need to fall within the lines of, I think for my moral standards, I want to make sure that they have access to things that are age appropriate. But if I need to have a conversation with them, I want to be able to have that conversation with them. Or if I want to take them to a drag show and a family-friendly drag show that's been advertised in that way, I absolutely have the right to do that. Or if my son wants to get on VR and go explore something, I want to be able to do that. It's my job as a parent to go ahead and police that and use the tools that these companies are putting together. And a lot of the companies are putting together tools where there is a parent-child interaction, but we're also cognizant of the fact that not every parent-child relationship is strong. Or if you have an LGBTQ individual who is not out to their parent and their parent is clearly highly against it, we need to be able to provide them a space to access information that is age appropriate, where they can get help, where they aren't finding supportive spaces. I mean, just thinking about youth in this country who don't have a supportive home, or maybe the Department of Social Services gets involved for some reason because there's abuse in the home. We don't tell those kids, no, you can't reach out to get help because it's not age appropriate. No, we encourage them to reach out and get help. So why would we stop a child from getting help where they're not being supported at home when it comes to an LGBTQ issue? I think that is kind of the parallel. There's this point where it comes to where there's certain things like LGBTQ or some of these other hot button issues where all of a sudden a governor gets involved and says that they can't have access to that information. But I'm quite sure if you turned it around and started talking about religion or wanting to be able to talk about anything else, or as I just provided an example, get help in a home that isn't supportive, or maybe they're facing abuse, that governor wouldn't stop that in any way, shape, or form. So I think we need to be realistic and be mindful of the fact that we do have a mental health crisis in this country, and we do need to be able to provide access and information. And the internet and these technology tools are a great way to do that. We don't need to overregulate, and we need to create space for, if it's not a bio parent, someone in the family or a teacher or educator, to be able to provide that safe space for a youth, because that ultimately is what is going to make sure that they don't have a mental health crisis, that they don't attempt suicide, that if they are having issues with connection to drugs or something, that they can get a hold of those resources. So I agree with you. I hope I answered your question, but I think there's a lot.
You absolutely did. Let's tick off strong and important words. Thank you. Let's tick off a quick reaction to some of the comments, and we will wrap up in that manner with final words. Maybe you want to take this one. How does the panel think that the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs will affect sensitive data processing with regard to who might be covered? I don't think we're going to, I don't think we believe that the covered entities are only big tech. We're not going to have a big tech definition of sensitive data. We already have many states and even the federal bill that define that non-HIPAA data is sensitive, but obviously we are seeing people look hard at what ought to be covered under that as a result of Dobbs. Amy?
Sure, and I can load this into my closing reactions, if you will. I think for decades now, Joan gave a really great history of the State of the Union. We've heard presidents say the State of the Union is strong, and we will continue to hear presidents into the future say the State of the Union is strong. But I think if we were honest with ourselves, we would see the state of our union actually right now is quite fragile, and we're really at an inflection point in regard to technology. There is a lot of good that can be done, but we're also on the precipice of, if we go the wrong way, we can see a lot of harm. And I think the Dobbs decision last year really demonstrates that. We have such potential for states to wreak havoc on the lives, or wrecking havoc on the lives of individuals across the country. And with one law, the federal government can give protection that now we're lacking, and really come back in a real positive way. But we need to get to that point, and I don't think it needs to be limited, Jules, as you said, to big tech. I think we need to look at a much more holistic view of the ecosystem. So, I mean, the federal government right now, we see agencies. It's hard to list the number of agencies in the federal government that are dealing with privacy. There are so many of them. I could tick them off and I would go and go and go. It's great that that's the focus of a lot of work. I think we're going to continue to see that be the focus of a lot of work. The speech last night indicated that all the way up to the top, all the way up to the president, privacy is on the radar, which might be the first time, at least in my career, that has been the case outside of the government surveillance sector, that we're really looking at commercial and individual privacy outside of government. And that's great. I think we need to recognize that there are a lot of decisions to be made this year that are going to affect the future. And this is the time to figure out what to do.
Thank you, Amy. And Joan, let me ask you to wrap us by addressing the question that was asked. Maybe one of the solutions is to toss more regulatory room for the FTC to fill in all these things and evolve regulations instead of it being legislated. My initial reaction is there's some constituencies that are very nervous about the chair of the FTC and want to really spell out exactly in law what the Congress should and shouldn't be doing. So I think the politics of that are hard. But what's your take? Can obviously the FTC is already doing a bunch of rulemaking, but is the solution tossing it to an agency as opposed to Congress?
I personally don't think so. These are really tough and they're really important issues, and they call for a lot of deep thought and really substantive conversations. I think it's very important that we're not reactionary in the way that we're sort of prescribing things. Congress is supposed to be a deliberative body, and it's set up that way that the government isn't reactionary, that the people's representatives aren't reactionary. Obviously, it's frustrating, and the White House is pushing things more on from the executive end because Congress hasn't been able to do anything. So, I mean, that's not ideal either. But if Congress were, a little less dysfunctional in some respects, I think that's the place where this should happen. It's funny that, Amy mentioned government surveillance, and she and I, our careers have followed similar tracks over the last decade, which is amazing. It's been 10 years. But it was very interesting when that was the big issue with the Snowden revelation and government surveillance and DHS and all of that people were really worried that, the US government was Big Brother and what an intrusion and how scary. And no one was really talking about the private sector and the commercial incentives for companies to collect data. So it's just interesting as an observation that we've come around to talking about this. But I guess just in closing my thoughts on this whole topic, these are really tough questions. There's going to be a lot of opinions. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, I think. But a place to start, and I'm sorry that Cam had to leave the call early, a place to start, I think, is at least agreeing to a set of principles. He put that out a decade ago. XRA, a plug for our organization, we have a set of privacy basics that we've put up on the website. I think at least if we can agree to some of the foundational elements of, what are the priorities here, and at least in broad strokes, what does this look like? Then we can use that as a touchstone as we start to craft the specifics.
thanks, Joan, for those comments. And also, frankly, as a newer trade organization, kudos for the way you and the members have been navigating what are really hard new issues by really engaging not just with the Hill, but civil society, kind of, recognizing the challenges. Not, we see lots of trades that are like, we're right, everyone else is a Luddite, let's fight the Hill, the Congress members are all dumb, and that doesn't work. But it's also, frankly, not the path to, I think, nuanced, hard thinking about issues that we all admit are complicated. So kudos for the success the organization has in building a lot of goodwill and credibility. It's what we need if we're going to grapple with these technologies. Thank you, Chris, who always is a great partner, helping us dig deeper into the way the communities so well are dealing with the challenges of data and innovative new ways. And Amy, for incredible leadership for our U.S. organization. Always learn from you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining. Bye, all.
Bye.
And Amy,